Welcome and hello. I'm Rochelle Weathersby, and I'm a consultant with Employment Practices Solutions, a nationwide human resources consulting company. Our company has partnered with TIS to bring you a webcast entitled Creating a Respectful Work Environment. I wanted to thank you on behalf of myself and TIS for tuning in today to talk about what a respectful work environment looks like and what we can do to maintain that type of environment here at TIS. First, a little bit about my background. I'm an employment law attorney who practiced in the Dallas area. In the late 90s, I switched my focus from the courtroom to the classroom to begin to help provide training on helping companies build and maintain cultures of respect and inclusion. I hope my experience today will help you understand what a respectful workplace looks like here at your hospital. You should have been provided a handout that follows my presentation today. Also, please know that a required quiz will immediately follow this course. Please watch the webcast in its entirety to help prepare you for the test that follows. Well, let's go ahead and get started and talk a little bit about our objectives and what we'll be covering today during our webcast. Our objective today is to provide you with the tools and policies to create and maintain a respectful work environment. Our focus today will be a discussion about the concepts of workplace bullying, disrespect, and incivility in the workplace. During our training today, we will discuss how to prevent, identify, and address these behaviors, why avoiding these behaviors is important to all of us as employees of TIS, and our company policies that prohibit these behaviors. Our overall goal today is to make sure you understand your responsibilities as an employee of TIS in ensuring a respectful workplace. Please know that your HR department is a continuing resource going forward for you if you have any feedback, thoughts, or questions about applying these concepts to your workplace interactions going forward after our webcast today. So let's go ahead and get started by discussing these concepts in detail. We'll examine statistics to take a look at who is involved in these issues, how prevalent it is, and how do we define these concepts. We'll then take a look at examples of behaviors that may make employees feel bullied, the types of behaviors that are not bullying or incivility, and the many ways these behaviors negatively impact us personally, our colleagues, and our workplace. Once we have defined these concepts, we'll take a look at what our company policies say so we can figure out how to prevent these behaviors and address conflict in a professional manner. The concept of a respectful workplace is not a new one. We have all heard this concept in the past in connection with company policies prohibiting discrimination, harassment, and retaliation in the workplace. But what we're talking about today really looks at how we treat each other on a daily basis and how those everyday interactions affect our workplace. Our goal is for us to exhibit professionalism with our tone of voice and choice of words, remain professional with our colleagues during stressful situations or when we disagree, do our best to make colleagues feel supported and included, demonstrate teamwork and be approachable, respect differences and be courteous, and work to build a cohesive, not divisive work environment. That is what our class today is about. So keeping that in mind, let's talk a little bit about who is typically involved in these situations by examining research. It was conducted by a website called workplacebullying.org. This organization conducted studies and found that in 72% of situations where employees feel bullied in the workplace, the bully had some sort of supervisor relationship with the subject of the bullying. However, in 18% of the situation involved was a peer-to-peer situation where a peer felt that another peer had bullied them or had exhibited bullying behaviors to them. So while that many of us may assume that bullying is only a concern for those who supervise employees, such as supervisors, the research shows us that it is something that requires the collective attention of our entire workforce to recognize and prevent, to make sure that we have the respectful work environment that we are striving for. Further research from this organization shows that 69% of bullies are men and 40% of people targeted are female. However, research also shows that female bullies target other females almost 70% of the time. So not only do concerns about these behaviors affect employees of all levels within an organizational chart, the issue also affects both female and male employees. Let's look at some additional statistics here from workplacebullying.org. just looking at how prevalent are these issues. According to this organization and their research, over a third of the U.S. workforce reports being bullied at work. Over a fifth of U.S. workers report having witnessing the bullying of others in the workplace. Moreover, while bullying is generally not illegal, research shows that it is 4 times more prevalent in the workplace than illegal harassment. What about in your industry in healthcare? The Joint Commission issued a quick safety advisory in 2016 entitled, "Bullying Has No Place in Healthcare." In this advisory, the Joint Commission cited a recent study by the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration, also known as OSHA, that reported that over 50% of registered nurses and nursing students responded to a survey, who responded to that survey, reported being verbally abused or bullied while working within the preceding 12-month period. The same advisory quoted a study of 284 healthcare workers in which 38% reported suffering psychological harassment. So based on these statistics, our industry reports a higher incidence rate of these behaviors than are reported in studies examining a wide array of industries. So now let's take a look at how do we define these concepts and what do they mean and what do our company policies say about them. Your employee handbook is a bullying and incivility policy that provides definitions for both of these behaviors. So let's start first from that policy and what its overall goal is. This policy says that TIS aspires to build an environment where all employees collaborate to create a culture of kindness and civility, and that this can only be accomplished with the willingness and cooperation of all employees. TIS expects employees to treat colleagues, coworkers, and others with dignity and respect, and to encourage others to do the same to promote the health, safety, and wellness of all employees, and also to ensure optimal outcomes across the healthcare continuum. Our policy states very clearly that TIS will not tolerate incivility and bullying by employees. The policy goes on and provides definitions of both of these behaviors. Incivility is one or more rude, discourteous, or disrespectful actions that may or may not have a negative intent behind them. Bullying is persistent, repeated, malicious, offensive, and intimidating behavior which humiliates, degrades, and displays a lack of dignity and respect for the target, resulting in them feeling vulnerable and threatened. So having defined these concepts, let's take a deeper look and talk a little bit about what sort of behaviors might be bullying in the workplace. I've put up a list here on the screen, and I'll go through this, and we'll talk about this. And as we go through our materials today, we'll also take a look at some examples of some workplace scenarios. So you might want to flip back to this portion of the materials when we get to later on in the class and take a look and see if you think that some of the behaviors exhibited in the video and in the case studies that we'll examine would fall under these categories. So going through this list, here are some examples of bullying behaviors. Spreading malicious rumors about a coworker, undermining a person's work, either by not assisting them or doing something deliberate to undermine the outcome. Threatening physical abuse towards a coworker. That could be done either verbally or through physical intimidation, such as aggressively getting up in someone's face during a disagreement or to make a point. Constantly changing work guidelines, withholding necessary information for a person to do their job, or purposely giving wrong information to an individual to try to undermine their performance, pestering, spying, or intruding on one's privacy. Talk about some more examples here. Assigning unreasonable duties or workloads which are unfavorable to one person. Underutilizing a person's ability to contribute in the workplace. They're basically creating a feeling of uselessness for that employee. Yelling or using profanity. I'd like to stop here for a moment and talk a little bit about this and make a distinction in this area. There's a big difference in using profanity as part of an excited utterance. For example, if I drop an instrument on my foot and I let out a curse word, that might be one example of profanity. There's a big difference, though, between that and then using profanity at someone or when I am criticizing their performance or their ideas. Profanity in those latter instances is like taking an exclamation point and putting it at the end of the sentence. It is also very unprofessional, is sometimes offensive, and could be perceived as aggressive towards someone if I'm using profanity in those situations. Other examples include criticizing a person persistently or constantly, humiliating a person. That could be insulting someone's intelligence or degrading them or putting them down in front of a group of individuals. And some other examples could be belittling a person's opinion, unwarranted or undeserved punishment or blame towards someone, blocking applications for training, leave, or promotion without a business reason for doing that, tampering with a person's personal belongings or work equipment. Let's say that I work with you. You know that I like to have a tidy desk. You don't like me. So on occasion, you'll come in and move things around in my desk when I'm not there because you know it's something that gets under my skin. Or perhaps I change someone's password or do something with instruments that they might be using during a procedure. All those types of things might be examples of tampering with someone's belongings or work equipment. You know, really, if you think about it, for behavior to be bullying, there's several things that are typically present. Typically, there's some sort of abusiveness towards the behavior. Also, typically there is an attempt by the bully to control the victim through these various behaviors that we've identified. Also, to be bullying, as we saw in the policy, generally the behavior has to be deliberate, or the actions have to be deliberate. There has to be a significant impact upon the person who is on the receiving end of that. And there's also typically an element of repetitiveness to the behavior, whether it's the same behavior over and over or whether there's different sort of negative behaviors exhibited towards that individual. So I think that gives us an idea of the types of things that might constitute bullying in the workplace, and certainly some of these things also would fall under our incivility policy that we talked about before. To provide a little more clarity, let's talk a little bit about what is not bullying. What types of actions or behaviors are not bullying in the workplace? You can see a list up here on your screen. The first one of these, if you have a coworker who is irritating, someone who's rude, someone who disagrees with you openly in a professional manner, or someone who has a vastly different communication style than you do. These types of behaviors are not considered bullying, although, of course, rude behavior may be incivility under the first part of the policy that we talked about. While on this topic, I think it's important to realize that sometimes when someone appears rude to us, it may just be due to that person having a different communication style. For example, some people may naturally be very direct, and it may seem off-putting to others who have a less direct style. In all fairness, it's a good idea to ask yourself, if you're getting the feeling that someone is treating you rudely or has been rude to you, ask yourself, was my coworker's behavior objectively rude? Or is it really that we have a different way of communicating information? There's a communication style difference that is creating this conflict in the workplace. Other things that are not bullying are reasonable employment decisions or actions. I may disagree with a schedule change that my supervisor, for example, implements, but it's not bullying if it was a reasonable action based on business need. Along those lines, a manager providing constructive feedback or having high performance standards is also not bullying. So having gone through these lists of behaviors that are bullying and that are not bullying gives us an idea of the types of things that can create this situation in the workplace. Some other things I want to focus on, I want to talk a little bit about some of the potential risks and costs of workplace bullying and incivility. So let's brainstorm for a few minutes and talk about that. I'd like to start with individual costs. And this would be individual costs and risks both to the person who is engaging in the bullying and the person who's the target of the bullying, or we'll call that person the bullied person. So let's think for a few minutes about that. What about the person who is on the receiving end of this conduct? How will that person feel? The individual who is targeted will suffer a whole host of negative feelings that will really affect his or her ability to do their best at work, and may also affect them significantly in personal ways. The target may feel fear, may feel ill, may feel isolated, they may lose sleep, or they may even dread coming to work. This may result in that person missing work, arriving late, taking more time off, and certainly when that person is at work, it will ultimately negatively affect that person's satisfaction with their job and ultimately their job performance. Let's also think about some of the other individual impacts. We could also mention the person that is engaging in the behavior. I'll call that person the bully. The bully will lose credibility in the workplace with their peers, their supervisors, and colleagues. They'll be seen as part of the problem, not part of the solution, and their judgment will be questioned. The bully may also be subject to disciplinary action up to and including termination. What are some of the other costs? So we talked a little bit on the individual level. Let's talk on the broader level, on the organizational level. What are some of the things that can occur if we tolerate bullying in the workplace? If you think about it, negative behaviors are toxic. Others who are not the bully or not the subject of bullying may find it very stressful to be around this behavior and may feel very uncomfortable. And certainly those behaviors being exhibited are distracting to others who are in the workplace. I think it's unquestionable that morale and teamwork will also suffer in the workplace. The Joint Commission, I mentioned the advisory earlier, the Joint Commission in that advisory also brought up the point that bullying exasperates the stress and demands of an already stressful and demanding profession, that being healthcare, and may drive talented people out of the profession altogether. The Joint Commission also has found that the impact upon patient safety can be significant. The impact on patient safety can include things such as the underreporting of safety and quality concerns, and it can also lead to increases in harm, errors, infection, and costs. So I think as we can see, the impact to individuals, the impact to organizations from these types of behaviors can be significant. I talked about individual impact. I want to take this a little bit further and think a little bit more about really what could this lead to for an individual, which in turn, as we've established, would affect the organization. The Workplace Bullying Institute, I mentioned that group earlier, they have found that the individual impact of bullying in the workplace is significant. And I think you can think about that in several different ways. There could be a physical impact upon the target. This could result in stress-related diseases and complications that can result from the prolonged exposure to stressors. Some of these can include effects on the cardiovascular system, such as increased risk of stroke or heart attack, neurological disruptions. The targets may see an increase in autoimmune disorders. Underlying medical conditions could be exacerbated. They may also see an increased incidence of skin disorders from the prolonged exposure to the stressors associated with bullying. Also, if you think about it, that oftentimes the personalized focus of bullying may also cause colleagues to lose confidence in their ability to do their job. They could experience damaged self-esteem, and they could also feel that their livelihood is threatened. This type of stressor could also lead to have an impact upon their mental health. It could cause things such as panic attacks, clinical depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. May make the victim feel shame that what has happened to them, and they may also feel guilt for having allowed the bully to control them. Certainly, I think that there's a number of issues that can develop from that, as we talked about, and impact an individual's health in a significant way. Also time and time again, we'll see that in hindsight, in a significant amount of workplace violence situations, there oftentimes were preceding workplace bullying behaviors that took place against the individual who ultimately committed the act of violence. And that individual may have committed that act of violence as a means of regaining control, where they felt before that they did not have that sense of control. Lastly, workplace bullying can also lead individuals to thoughts of harming themselves, even at the point of thinking about or attempting or committing suicide. So clearly, these impacts are something we all want to avoid. And having examined what bullying is, who the perpetrators are, how we've defined it, also the definition of incivility, and we'll also talk about the risks of some of these behaviors. Let's take a look at starting to identify problematic behaviors and what we can do to prevent them. So what I'd like to do now is show you a video of a workplace scenario. And as you watch this, consider what we talked about before in terms of behaviors and what may be displayed in here. If you see any behaviors, any actions in here that look to be acts of incivility or acts of bullying to you.
Sorry to keep bothering you. When I went to format, like you said, it gave me a window I haven't seen before. I was wondering...
Come on, Jim. This isn't rocket science. I mean, any third grader could figure this out. What is it that you don't understand?
Forget it. I'll figure it out.
What's his problem?
Who knows? Probably forgot his meds.
Let's talk about this video. Let's first look and see what were the issues that were raised by behavior here. Well, I think the issues that we have here, we have two colleagues who are not treating each other with respect. The man sitting at the desk was likely annoyed by his colleague's repeated interruptions of his work. But that is no excuse for demeaning his intelligence with the comment, well, any third grader could figure it out, and his dismissive body language. In turn, the man who was standing was also disrespectful by making sarcastic remarks, implying that his coworker had a medical condition and gossiping about him to another coworker. Is this behavior bullying? One incident like this wouldn't be bullying, but what if the behavior escalated? What if the man sitting engaged in a persistent pattern of demeaning his colleague, whose work was being undermined because he couldn't get answers to the questions he needed to do his job? What if the other man started engaging in repeated malicious gossip, implying that the man sitting down had a medical condition or a mental condition that impacted his ability to do his job? In that instance, we may be starting to move on to a situation where one or more of the parties are feeling that they're being bullied. Is the behavior harassment? Treating someone rudely is not harassment unless it is because of a protected trait. Things like race, gender, religion, national origin, age, disability. However, the comment about, quote, who knows, he's probably off his meds, a comment of that nature would not be appropriate under TIF's harassment prevention policy because this comment implies that the colleague is suffering from a mental disability. And whether this is a true statement or simply sarcastic, it is inappropriate under the policy. What we do know is that both have acted unprofessionally towards each other. The impact is that their working relationship has been damaged and may be hard to repair. Also, as we can see, these behaviors are toxic and impact other colleagues who see, hear, or learn of the behavior. Both parties could have easily handled this professionally. The man who walked up did use an appropriate tone of voice, but he did indicate that he had interrupted the man sitting several times. Perhaps he could have emailed him and set a time to talk about the computer issues he was having. And clearly the man sitting should have managed his frustration, and if he was too busy to help his colleague at the time, professionally said, hey, I've got some work I've got to get finished now. Can I get back to you as soon as I get finished? So anytime two coworkers can't be civil to each other, it puts patient care at risk. Errors may be made because lines of communication are broken down, even if we're in an office setting processing documents. If we're in the OR or hospital setting, strained communication and feeling disrespected by a colleague is very distracting and can lead to major mistakes that can significantly affect patient care. So what are the takeaways in this video? I think as we can see, as we saw demonstrated here, poor communication can negatively impact morale, work relationships, and certainly productivity. Poor communication can contribute to misperceptions in the workplace and complaints. Regardless if the behavior is bullying, incivility, or harassment, it's not okay at TIS, and it's inconsistent with our policies and our corporate culture. So now that we have talked about and identified what these behaviors are and talked about some of the risks involved, I'd like to shift our focus and talk about what can we do to prevent and respond to these issues if they do happen. Let's start by looking at your policies here at TIS. I notice that has in the policy handbook, TIS sets forth its pillars of excellence. In joining the TIS team, you have become part of the tradition for providing excellent care to our patients. TIS believes it's important to create a workplace based on our mission and values. To achieve this goal, TIS and its employees must be committed to the values that shape our culture, and our culture, which are respect, integrity, caring, and excellence. These values permeate throughout hospital policies and procedures. Employees must be committed to the following pillars of excellence to ensure the mutual success of our employees and TIS. The pillar of respect sets out the expectation for how TIS expects all employees to treat each other. As employees, we are expected to treat each other as follows. We're expected to treat patients, visitors, and colleagues with respect and courtesy, respect the individuality, privacy, and dignity of patients, visitors, and colleagues, work collaboratively to help others, promote cooperation between colleagues and departments, respect and listen to coworker ideas, recognize and support the skills and qualities of others, communicate any concerns, suggestions, and ideas to the appropriate staff members in an open and honest fashion, and engage in positive interactions with patients, visitors, and colleagues. Along these lines, as I mentioned before, TIS has a bullying and incivility policy in its employee handbook. This policy states that TIS will not tolerate incivility and bullying by employees. All reports of incivility and bullying will be treated in the same manner as harassment and discrimination. Under this policy, report immediately to your supervisor, human resources, and/or compliance if you perceive that you are being subjected to incivility or bullying in the workplace. Keep in mind that under this policy, employees will not be retaliated against for reporting instances of incivility or bullying. The policy in its entirety is contained in your employee handbook, and I encourage you to take a look at that to make sure you're familiar with what the policy says. As I mentioned before, bullying is generally not illegal. Bullying may be harassment if based on a protected characteristic. So under TIS policy, it would be harassment for an employee to exhibit bullying behaviors towards a colleague based on the colleague's race, color, religion or creed, national origin or ancestry, sex, age, which would be over 40, physical or mental disability, veteran status, family medical history or genetic information, citizenship, use of medical leave, including FMLA that was authorized by TIS, gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, or any other consideration prohibited by TIS policies and procedures and/or local, state, and federal law. So under this, if an employee is harassing another employee because of their gender, for example, or bullying another employee because of their gender, this could be harassment. Or if in the course of an employee disrespecting a colleague, that employee uses language that references or implicates a protected characteristic such as gender, this sort of behavior could also be harassment. Also, if a person has made a past complaint under TIS policies, treating that person in a bullying manner afterwards can be a form of retaliation. So if a fellow employee brings a complaint against you, you need to treat that person the same as you would if they had not brought a complaint. Of course, eliminating the behavior that led to the complaint. Any bullying behaviors towards that person, malicious gossip, exclusion, any sort of hostility, could be a form of retaliation under our policies. So if you see any of these behaviors happen to yourself or someone else, it's important that you speak up and report it to your supervisor, HR, or compliance. So now we've talked about what these concepts are. We have gone over the TIS policies that relate to these and the behaviors that will not be tolerated by TIS. Let's talk about prevention. The key way to prevent this is to respect others. We don't have to like everyone we encounter at work, but we do have to treat them with respect and professionalism. Another important part of prevention is addressing conflict before it escalates. TIS has a pledge to peer policies that set out ways to do this, which we will discuss momentarily. It's also important to be self-aware and realize how our behavior impacts others. Remember, people may not remember your words, but they will remember how you made them feel. So I'd like to go ahead and take a look at one more case study here and talk through some of these issues. And let's, as you go through this, keep in mind some of the things we've talked about before, our policies, the definition of what bullying and civility would be, and let's discuss whether some of these behaviors we see exhibited in this case study would fall under those definitions. So here we meet Julie and Pam. They are both TIS employees. They do not get along well, and they are stuck in an operating room together. Pam perceives Julie, who can be abrasive, as a know-it-all who is unwilling to listen to differing opinions. In turn, Julie thinks Pam can be lazy and is always looking for shortcuts. One day, Pam overhears a conversation in the operating room between Julie and Frank, a technician, and perceives that Julie is entirely out of line with her tone of voice. Afterwards, Pam pulls Frank aside and tells him, "I can't stand her. She's done that to me before, too." Frank appreciates Pam's support of him and shares with her some other incidents where Julie chewed out employees in the OR. After this, whenever Frank, Pam, and Julie are in the OR together, Frank and Pam steal glances at each other when Julie talks and roll their eyes. They also mimic Julie when she walks out of the OR, which gets a lot of laughter from some of the other nurses in the OR. While setting up for a procedure today, Julie notices that Pam has not followed the appropriate sterile processing procedures. Typical Pam, she thinks. She's so busy gossiping that she took another shortcut. Julie's thinking this to herself while she's shaking her head silently and moving on to the next operating room. So let's talk about some of the issues here. What concerns are present here in this situation? So clearly, Julie, Pam, and Frank are all not treating each other civilly, as well as the other colleagues that are laughing at the mimicking behavior. Both Julie and Pam have negative perceptions of each other that they are just not managing, and instead allowing these perceptions to affect their professionalism toward one another. It appears that Julie is addressing colleagues in an abrasive manner, and instead of addressing the underlying conflict, Pam and Frank are disparaging Julie behind her back by talking badly about her and gossiping about her. They are also ganging up on Julie by stealing glances at each other when she speaks, belittling her by rolling their eyes at each other, and mimicking her. As we discussed before, this behavior is not consistent with the TIS incivility and bullying policy, and all employees involved may be subject to discipline for their behaviors if this is indeed going on. The environment has gotten so bad now that Julie is not speaking up when she sees a mistake that Pam made that clearly compromises patient safety. The consequences of this situation could be quite dangerous for the patient and put the hospital and the employees at risk for failing to follow policy. This could have been easily avoided if Julie spoke up to Pam, but clearly she didn't feel that she could do that because there was so much bad blood between these two, or she felt that she wanted to get Pam in trouble for not following procedure. So let's take a moment and think, how should have this been handled? Clearly, Julie and Pam should have tried to work out their conflict before it ever got to this point. It would have been much easier to address this before it got to a point that both let it affect their judgment. Also along the way, someone should have spoken up and said these behaviors are not okay. So let's talk about a little bit some of the things here and talk about what some solutions could be to solving this problem and not avoiding and not getting into the situation, avoiding it. So one takeaway that I see from this case study is that bullying need not be overt. In the case study above, we saw several subtle forms of bullying, the spreading of rumors, possibly abrasiveness that left Jeff and others feeling belittled, Julie being singled out and isolated socially from her peers who were laughing at her, and Julie undermining Pam's work performance and putting patient safety at risk. And oftentimes in the real world, bullying and incivility does present itself in these forms. So I think it's important as we work to prevent these issues that we watch out for subtleties. You know, like I talked about before, bullying is about exerting control over and humiliating others. Some of the subtle forms of bullying may include spreading rumors or innuendo about someone, belittling someone, exclusion or isolating someone socially, unwarranted monitoring of an employee, intimidating behavior, undermining work performance, or even nonverbal behaviors like we saw exhibited in this case study, like the eye rolling or some of the nonverbal behaviors that we saw in the earlier video. So I think it's important to be aware of subtleties and make sure that we ourselves are not engaging in behaviors like this. Sometimes these behaviors happen when we are frustrated about how others have treated us in the workplace. And the professional thing to do is to manage that frustration and try to manage the conflict and resolve it before we get to a situation that our judgment is affected. Let's talk briefly about our Pledge to Peer policy that is a part of TIS's conflict resolution policy. Looking at this policy, this policy encourages employees to resolve conflicts by speaking with the other employee involved directly, talking to that person professionally, directly, and promptly to address conflict before it escapes. The best way to do this is to think about possible solutions to the situation, then ask the other individual if you can speak to them one-on-one. And when we have that discussion, I think it's important to speak to them in the spirit of the following, something where basically we're coming to solve the situation as part of a team. So address the situation in the spirit of, I'd like to talk to you about our working relationship and what we can do to improve it. In having that conversation, I think it's important to say what you mean what you say, and don't be mean about it. If you're not comfortable approaching the other employee directly about the conflict, then you should probably bring the attention to your supervisor to mediate the conflict. If you want to address the other employee directly but don't really know how to go about doing it, I'd suggest thinking about possible solutions, and then you can always go to your supervisor or HR for guidance in the best way to approach the conversation one-on-one with the individual with whom you're having the conflict. So once again, this I think is a very helpful way of being proactive to address these issues before they rise to the level of a work environment where individuals' judgment and professionalism is affected and possibly patient safety is also put at risk. I'd mentioned being self-aware. Here's some other things you can do to, looking at signs that you might be a bully. And here's a checklist I think is very helpful that you might want to take a look at. I consider asking yourself, do I engage in bullying behaviors? So here's some examples of that. Your colleagues don't make eye contact when talking to you. You are quick to assign blame. You are a yeller. Your direct reports avoid seeking your input. You talk more than you listen. You rarely accept others' input or ideas. No one seems to ever disagree with you or share bad news with you. If you answered yes to one or more of these behaviors, it's a good idea to take some time now to think about how these behaviors may be impacting your colleagues, our commitment to respect in the workplace, and our commitment to providing excellent patient care. And consider taking personal responsibility to make positive changes in how you interact with others. Along those lines, here are some suggestions. When we talk about courteous communication in the workplace, what does that look like? Some of these I think are self-explanatory, but things that sometimes as we get so busy going about our daily work that we forget to incorporate in our interactions. I call the first things the magic words. Try to incorporate please, thank you, I'm sorry, and that's okay in conversations as much as possible when communicating with colleagues and resolving conflict or asking people for assistance. It's important to honor preferences of others. If someone asks to have a conversation with you and brings a communication issue to your attention, I think it's important to respond professionally and say thank you for letting me know about that. I'm glad we have the opportunity to discuss this, and I'm going to work going forward to make sure that we improve our relationship. Obviously, we want to avoid any kind of communications that demean or devalue, whether it's based on the words that we use, the tone of voice, or our body language, and we saw some examples of that in our case studies today. We also want to try to avoid any sort of subtle expressions of hostility. Those type of things are often expressed vis-a-vis body language, and we want to be aware of that, or vis-a-vis tone of voice. Certainly gossiping about colleagues is counterproductive, is disruptive, and is also divisive. It also doesn't solve the situation that's going on, but perpetuates it and gives it a life of its own. And clearly, de-escalating conflict and addressing it professionally and promptly is the key, I think, to managing all of these issues. So in summary today, I think that we've laid out for you an example of what bullying and incivility looks like in the workplace. We have laid out the expectations set forth in the TIS policies and provided you with the hospital's no tolerance approach on that, and also provide you some guidelines on behaviors that to be avoided, also guidelines on behaviors that are very helpful in resolving these issues. Really, I think in summary of what we discussed today, I think that a couple of things to take away. I like to follow what I call the new golden rule, and what that is I think many of us are familiar with what we call the golden rule, which exists in many different cultures and religions in different forms. But basically, do unto others as you would do unto yourself. I think that in terms of building a respectful workplace, the important thing to focus on is basically treating others how they want to be treated, and treating others with an abundance of professionalism and respect, and being mindful of how our communications may come across to others. And I think those are some of the things that we can do to build the environment that I know that we want to continue to maintain and foster. So thank you very much for your time and attention today. And as I mentioned before, you should have materials that were provided to you that you can keep as a reference, a summary of what we covered today. And there will also be a quiz that will go over these concepts today to ensure understanding and learning of them. But thank you for your time and attention today, and I hope you found today's session valuable and thought-provoking. And once again, as I mentioned earlier, if you need any further assistance with the concepts that we talked about today, your HR team and your management stands ready to assist you going forward in incorporating what we discussed today and putting it in place into your hospital. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.